An old woman stands on the street corner, holding a torn cardboard sign. Please help me. My granddaughter needs a miracle. Thousands pass her by, ignoring her pain. But then, a sleek black limousine stops. A billionaire steps out. And in that moment, a decision is made that will change their lives and the world forever. This is the story of one act of kindness that sparked a movement. Are you ready to be inspired? The city was alive, pulsating with the chaotic energy of a summer afternoon. The sun loomed high, casting long shadows across the towering skyscrapers and shimmering off the hoods of endless streams of honking cars. Pedestrians flooded the sidewalks, moving with a determined urgency, their faces buried in phones or conversations, unaware of anything beyond their immediate destinations. Inside a sleek black limousine that blended effortlessly with the luxury vehicles navigating the congested avenues, Jonathan Hale, a man of both power and influence, sat deep in thought. The rhythmic hum of the car's movement and the muffled honking outside created a background noise that he had long since learned to tune out. Jonathan was reviewing reports, projections, stock values, a potential merger deal that could redefine the global market. Numbers, figures, forecasts. These were the things that dictated his time, his thoughts, his life. His advisor, Daniel Carter, sat across from him, speaking in a steady, professional tone, relaying updates about the company's latest ventures. Our acquisition proposal for quantum tech is in its final stages, Daniel said. Pending board approval, the deal could close within the month. If the market reacts favorably, our stock value could rise by at least 5% overnight. Jonathan nodded, only half listening. It was another win in a long list of victories, another step in securing a legacy that most could only dream of. But then, something outside the window caught his attention. For the first time in a long while, Jonathan stopped thinking about numbers. Amid the relentless current of pedestrians, a frail figure stood still, like a rock against the tide. An elderly woman, barely more than skin and bones, her hair stark white, her clothes faded and loose on her small frame. Her face was deeply lined, a map of time and hardship etched into her skin. She held a sign, its edges frayed, its words barely legible from years of exposure to the elements. Please help me. My granddaughter needs a miracle. Jonathan felt something stir within him, something unfamiliar, something he didn't have a name for. Most people walking past her didn't spare her a second glance. Some looked, then quickly turned away, as if making eye contact would somehow make them responsible. Others barely noticed her at all, lost in their own fast-paced lives. But Jonathan saw her, and he couldn't look away. "Stop the car," he said, his voice firm. The driver hesitated, glancing at him through the rearview mirror. "Sir?" "I said stop the car!" The motorcade of black vehicles came to an abrupt halt, right in the middle of a busy intersection. Horns blared in frustration, drivers craning their necks to see what had caused the sudden stop. Inside the limousine, Jonathan's team exchanged uncertain glances. "Sir, this isn't a safe area," one of his security officers cautioned. Jonathan ignored him. His gaze remained locked on the woman standing on the sidewalk. Without another word, he reached for the door handle and stepped out. The moment his polished shoes touched the pavement, the atmosphere shifted. The noise of the city seemed to soften, as if the world itself was holding its breath. People noticed. A man like Jonathan Hale, a billionaire, a titan of industry, a household name, did not simply stop his limousine in the middle of traffic to step onto a random street corner. Pedestrians paused, murmurs spreading like wildfire. A few recognized him immediately, pulling out their phones to capture the moment. Why was he here? What was he doing? Jonathan ignored the growing whispers and walked forward, his steps slow but deliberate, his eyes never leaving the frail woman before him. When he reached her, he knelt slightly, bringing himself closer to her level. She flinched at first, as if she expected him to scold her or tell her to move along. But instead he asked, gently yet firmly, "What's your name?" Her cloudy eyes flickered with a mixture of fear and disbelief. She hesitated, as if unsure whether she should answer. "Margaret," she finally whispered, her voice hoarse. "Margaret Whitmore." Jonathan nodded. "Margaret, can you tell me your story?" Her grip on the cardboard sign tightened. She swallowed, her thin frame trembling. She had been ignored for so long, passed by like a forgotten ghost of the city. And now, here stood one of the most powerful men in the country, looking at her, not with pity, but with something she hadn't seen in years: understanding. She took a deep, shuddering breath and said, "I don't know where to begin." Inside the limousine, Jonathan's security team remained tense. Daniel Carter, watching through the open door, exchanged glances with another advisor. "What's he doing?" "I have no idea." "Is this some sort of PR stunt?" "If it is, it wasn't planned." The security detail stood alert, scanning the surroundings, wary of any potential threats. This wasn't the kind of area their employer should be lingering in, but none of them dared to interrupt. Jonathan was listening, and he wasn't leaving until he had heard Margaret's story. Margaret lifted her gaze, her cloudy blue eyes meeting Jonathan Hale's with a mix of uncertainty and disbelief. The billionaire knelt in front of her, his piercing green eyes locked onto hers, waiting, listening. For a moment, she hesitated. Was this real? Was someone finally listening? She took a shaky breath. "My granddaughter, Emily, she's all I have left." Jonathan's eyes darkened slightly, his expression unreadable. "Go on," he urged, his voice steady but soft. Margaret swallowed hard. It had been a long time since someone had asked for her story, and even longer since someone had cared enough to hear it. Margaret looked down at her trembling hands, memories flooding back like a storm that never ceased. "We lost everything in the flood," she began, her voice fragile yet unwavering. "My son and daughter-in-law, they didn't make it." Jonathan remained silent, his sharp gaze never leaving her. Margaret exhaled deeply, steadying herself before she continued. "It was supposed to be just another rainy night," she whispered, her mind drifting back to that dreadful evening. "But the water, it came so fast." She could still hear the thunderous roar of the river bursting its banks, swallowing everything in its path. The rain had pounded against their small home's roof like an angry beast, wind howling through the cracks in the windows. Her son, David, had woken her first. "Mom, get up, now." His voice had been frantic, unlike anything she had ever heard before. She barely had time to register what was happening before she stepped out of bed and felt it, freezing water rising past her ankles. The next few moments had been a blur of chaos. Emily, only 9 years old at the time, had clung to her parents, her tiny voice barely audible over the deafening sound of the flood. "Daddy, I'm scared." "It's okay, sweetheart," David had assured her. "We'll get out of this." But they hadn't. David and his wife Laura had shoved Margaret and Emily toward the door, shouting at them to run to higher ground. "We'll catch up," they had promised. But the water was merciless. It took them. Just like that. Margaret's fingers dug into her sign as the memories suffocated her. "I found my son hours later, but it was too late." She bit her lip, blinking back tears. "After that, it was just me and Emily. She lost her parents, I lost my child, and we had nowhere to go." Jonathan exhaled slowly, absorbing every word. The weight of her pain settled deep in his chest, something he hadn't expected. "What happened after that?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Margaret shook her head. "I did what I could, but I'm old. I'm weak." She looked around at the city, the towering glass buildings, the flashing billboards, the endless streams of people who had ignored her for so long. "We slept in a shelter for a while, but shelters don't last forever," she continued. "I tried to work, cleaning houses, washing dishes, anything. But no one wants to hire someone like me anymore." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "So you ended up here?" Margaret nodded. "I didn't have a choice. I stood here, hoping someone, anyone, would stop. But people don't see me anymore." Her voice cracked, and she quickly wiped at her eyes, as if ashamed of showing emotion. "They just walk past, as if I don't exist." Jonathan glanced around. She was right. The people passing by barely spared them a glance. Some looked uncomfortable, others quickened their pace, avoiding eye contact entirely. How many times had she stood here, invisible to the world? How many people had walked by without a second thought? Jonathan felt an unfamiliar knot form in his stomach. Margaret lowered her gaze. "I don't want pity. I don't need charity." She straightened her spine, her frail body trembling slightly. "I just need someone to see us, to help my granddaughter. She deserves a chance." Jonathan inhaled deeply. This wasn't just about Margaret or Emily. It was about something bigger, Margaret had spent years being ignored, passed over by people who refused to acknowledge her existence. She wasn't just fighting for survival, she was fighting to be seen. Jonathan couldn't be another person who walked away. He stood up, turning to his security detail. "Get the car ready," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. His head of security, Ethan Cross, frowned. "Sir, this is not a safe—" Jonathan cut him off. "If she can live there, I can visit." His gaze darkened. "If you're scared, stay behind." Silence. No one argued. Jonathan turned back to Margaret, extending his hand. "Take me to her?" Margaret's lips parted slightly in surprise. No one had ever asked that before. She hesitated, just for a second, before nodding. For the first time in years, she felt something she had thought was long gone. Hope. With slow, careful steps, she began to walk. And Jonathan Hale, a man who had spent his entire life focused on success, followed without hesitation. Little did either of them know, this single act of kindness would set into motion a movement that would change countless lives. This was just the beginning. The city had always been divided, not just by wealth and status, but by something far more profound: visibility. Margaret Whitmore and her granddaughter Emily had lived on the edges of society, unseen by the very people who walked past them daily. Now, for the first time, Jonathan Hale, a billionaire accustomed to polished boardrooms and luxury estates, was about to step into their world. As they walked, Margaret's frail figure moved slowly, her bony fingers gripping her sign as if it were the last tangible piece of her past. Behind them, Jonathan's convoy of sleek black vehicles crawled forward, an odd contrast against the crumbling buildings and dimly lit alleyways. The further they walked, the more the city's grandeur faded. Gleaming skyscrapers were replaced by dilapidated structures. Once pristine streets were now riddled with cracks, and the vibrant storefronts gave way to boarded-up shops, their windows shattered long ago. Jonathan remained silent, observing everything. For the first time in his life, he saw it, not from a distance, not through filtered reports, but up close. The desperation, the exhaustion, the silent suffering that had no voice. Margaret led him into a narrow alley. The smell of damp cardboard and rotting food filled the air, and Jonathan instinctively tensed. A few stray dogs rummaged through overturned trash cans, their ribs visible through their matted fur. On either side of the alley, people sat hunched against the walls, their faces worn with years of hardship. Some whispered as they saw Jonathan. Others barely glanced at him, too accustomed to disappointment to react. Jonathan's security detail followed closely, their eyes scanning every corner, but Jonathan didn't hesitate. He just kept walking. Margaret stopped in front of what could barely be called a shelter. At first glance, it looked like a pile of discarded materials, plastic tarps stretched over splintered wood, old bricks stacked unevenly to form makeshift walls. The door was nothing more than a torn piece of cloth. Margaret turned to Jonathan. "She's inside." Jonathan stepped forward and gently pulled the cloth aside. Inside the tiny shelter, sitting on a thin, tattered blanket, was Emily. She was small for her age, too small. Her dark brown hair was tangled, her oversized shirt hung loosely off her thin frame, and her bare feet were covered in dirt. In her hands, she held a makeshift doll, crafted from an old plastic bottle wrapped in fabric scraps. It was crude, but well-loved, its fabric frayed from years of being clutched tightly. As soon as the sunlight filtered into the small space, Emily looked up. Her large brown eyes met Jonathan's, not with fear, not with hope, but with something far more heartbreaking: caution. Margaret crouched beside her. "Emily, sweetheart, this is Mr. Hale. He wants to help." Emily didn't speak at first. She only studied him, as if trying to determine whether he was real. Jonathan lowered himself to her level, careful not to appear imposing. "You don't have to be afraid," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Your grandmother told me about you." Emily's fingers tightened around her doll. She swallowed hard before finally whispering, "Are you going to take her away from me?" Jonathan frowned. "What?" Emily's lips trembled. "The other people. When they take kids, they don't let them stay with their grandmas." Jonathan's chest tightened. He understood now. Margaret had likely been told more than once that Emily would be better off in the system, placed in a home with real stability. But Emily didn't want that. She had already lost her parents. She couldn't lose her grandmother, too. Jonathan took a slow breath. No, Emily, I'm not here to take anyone away. I'm here to help, both of you. Emily's grip on her doll loosened, but her expression remained guarded. Why? She asked. No one ever helps us. Her words hit Jonathan like a hammer. How many times had this child watched as people walked past them? How many empty promises had she heard before? Jonathan clenched his jaw. Because this time, someone is finally listening. Jonathan turned to Margaret. What do you two eat? Margaret sighed. Whatever I can find. She motioned toward a small tin can by the corner. Inside were a few pieces of stale bread and a half-empty bottle of water. Jonathan's stomach twisted. He turned back to Emily. Are you hungry? Emily hesitated before giving the smallest nod. Without missing a beat, Jonathan gestured toward his security team. Get them food, now. His men didn't hesitate. One of them immediately stepped away, speaking into his earpiece. Jonathan turned back to Margaret. What about health care? Has she seen a doctor? Margaret looked away. Doctors cost money. That was all she needed to say. Jonathan's mind raced. How had he not seen this before? He had donated to charities. His company had launched social programs. But none of that had reached them. People like Margaret and Emily had been left behind. And for the first time in his life, Jonathan Hale knew that writing a check wasn't enough. Minutes later, one of his security men returned with a bag of food. Emily's eyes widened as the man set it down. A fresh sandwich, an apple, a bottle of clean water. Margaret reached for it hesitantly. We can't pay. You don't have to, Jonathan interrupted. Margaret looked up at him, her eyes glassy with gratitude. Emily, still cautious, watched as Margaret unwrapped the sandwich and handed half to her. She took a slow, careful bite, then another. Jonathan exhaled. This was only one meal, but it was a start. He turned to his team. I want a full report on this shelter, the conditions here, and the people who live in this area. His advisor, Daniel Carter, hesitated. Sir, perhaps this is something best left to... No. Jonathan's voice was firm. We've ignored this long enough. If a little girl like Emily can stand here and keep fighting, we have no excuse to walk away. Silence followed. No one argued. Jonathan turned back to Margaret and Emily. Starting tonight, everything changes. I promise you that. Margaret covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking. Emily, still chewing, looked up at him again. This time, there was something new in her eyes, something that hadn't been there before. Hope. Jonathan nodded to himself. The air in the alley felt different now. Jonathan Hale stood in the dim light, his gaze flickering between Margaret, who still held her granddaughter protectively, and Emily, whose wide eyes now carried a fragile glimmer of hope. For years, no one had seen them. No one had listened. But tonight, that was going to change. Jonathan took a deep breath and turned to Daniel Carter, his senior advisor, who had been standing quietly behind him. I want immediate action. Daniel shifted uneasily. Sir, these things take time. Jonathan's sharp gaze cut through the words before they could fully form. Number time is a luxury they don't have. Start making calls now. Daniel hesitated only a second before pulling out his phone. Jonathan turned to Ethan Cross, his head of security. I want medical teams here before the night is over. Food and supplies need to arrive within hours. This entire area needs an assessment. Who lives here, what they need, and how fast we can make a difference. Ethan gave a slight nod. Understood, sir. He signaled two men, who immediately began making arrangements. Margaret watched it all unfold with disbelief. Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan met her gaze, unwavering. Because someone should have done it a long time ago. Word of Jonathan Hale's unexpected detour spread like wildfire. By morning, the story had hit every major news outlet. Billionaire Jonathan Hale stops motorcade to help homeless grandmother and child. Hale seen in the slums. What does this mean for the city's forgotten? Camera crews began appearing near the alley, eager to capture the unbelievable sight of a man like Jonathan Hale standing among the city's most destitute. Social media exploded. For once, a rich guy isn't just talking about charity, he's doing something about it. We need more people like Jonathan Hale in the world. Maybe there's still some hope left in humanity, but not all the reactions were positive. Some critics called it a publicity stunt. Others dismissed it as a temporary display of generosity that would fade as soon as the headlines did. Jonathan didn't care about any of that, because he wasn't doing this for headlines. He was doing this for Emily and Margaret, and for every other family like them who had been forgotten. By noon, the first trucks rolled in, large vehicles filled with food, clean water, blankets, and medical supplies. Doctors and nurses in crisp uniforms set up makeshift stations in the alley, immediately tending to the most vulnerable. Children with hollow cheeks were given food. Elderly residents who had long suffered untreated illnesses finally received medical attention. Emily sat on a plastic crate, a bowl of warm soup in her hands, staring at the scene around her. She had never seen anything like it. "Grandma, look," she whispered. Margaret, still holding on to Emily's shoulder, as if afraid this might all vanish in an instant, let out a trembling breath. "I see it, baby," she murmured. "I see it." Jonathan stood nearby, watching it all unfold. He had accomplished a lot in his lifetime, built empires, sealed billion-dollar deals, shaped industries. But he had never felt the weight of his own actions like he did right now. Daniel Carter approached him. "Sir, we've set up contacts with multiple aid organizations. They're ready to assist, but they need direction." Jonathan nodded. "Good. We're not just bringing temporary relief. We're fixing the system." The more time Jonathan spent in the area, the more stories he heard. A war veteran, Samuel Grant, leaned on a cane as he approached Jonathan. "I fought for this country," he said. "Came home to nothing. No job, no benefits. I survive on scraps." A single mother, Lena Dawson, cradled her sick baby in her arms. "My husband died in the flood. I work at a factory, but it's not enough. My child hasn't seen a doctor in months." Jonathan listened. For the first time, they weren't invisible. When more and more people gathered, Jonathan climbed onto a wooden crate, addressing the crowd. "I've heard your stories, and I want you to know, you are not forgotten anymore." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded, others wiped their eyes. "This city has ignored you. Society has failed you. That ends today." A single clap broke the silence, then another, and another, until the entire street erupted into applause. For the first time in years, these people felt like someone was fighting for them, and that changed everything. The movement was growing faster than anyone expected, but not everyone was happy about it. By nightfall, city officials were already pushing back. A government representative, Richard Calloway, called an urgent meeting. "Mr. Hale, while we appreciate your generosity, this isn't something you can just handle overnight." Jonathan's gaze was cold. "That's exactly what I'm doing." Calloway sighed, trying to keep his composure. "There are protocols for these things, funds, approvals, regulations. You can't just start a citywide effort without government involvement." Jonathan smirked. "Watch me." Calloway bristled. "You're making us look bad." "No," Jonathan corrected. "You made yourselves look bad when you let these people suffer for years without doing anything." Silence. Jonathan leaned forward. "I suggest you either help me or stay out of my way." Calloway had no response, because deep down, he knew Jonathan was right. Later that evening, Margaret approached Jonathan, her eyes filled with something he hadn't seen before, genuine relief. "You did this," she whispered. "You actually did this." Jonathan shook his head. "No, Margaret, you did this. You held that sign. You refused to give up." She swallowed hard, blinking back tears. "I thought I was invisible." Jonathan exhaled. "Not anymore." Beside them, Emily smiled for the first time in years. And that was when Jonathan knew. This wasn't just about helping one family. This was about changing everything. This was just the beginning. For the first time in years, hope had found its way into the forgotten corners of the city. By the next morning, the slum where Margaret Whitmore and Emily lived was no longer just a neglected, invisible part of the metropolis. It had become the center of something bigger. Trucks carrying food, clean water, medical supplies, and blankets continued to arrive. Doctors and volunteers worked tirelessly, tending to the sick, feeding the hungry, and listening to the voices that had long been ignored. Jonathan Hale stood at the edge of it all, watching as the world around him transformed before his eyes. And yet, he knew. This was only the beginning. Jonathan was never a man to think small. His mind was wired for expansion, strategy, execution. If this was going to work, it had to be bigger than just one community. He called for a private meeting at a temporary command center set up near the shelter. Nothing fancy, just a large tent with folding tables, laptops, and a few whiteboards. Inside, his top executives, advisors, and partners gathered. Daniel Carter, his senior advisor, was the first to speak. "Sir, this is growing beyond what any of us expected. The media coverage alone—" Jonathan cut him off. "I don't care about the media." He turned, addressing the room. "What we've done here is a first step, but I didn't come here for a publicity stunt. I came here to fix a broken system." He grabbed a marker and drew a large map on the whiteboard. "We're expanding this effort to every neglected area in the city," he announced. "Not just food and water. We're talking long-term solutions: housing, healthcare, education, and job opportunities." There was a moment of silence as the weight of his words settled over the room. Then, Ethan Cross, his head of security, cleared his throat. "That's going to require massive funding and logistical coordination, sir." Jonathan didn't hesitate. "I know. That's why I'm personally funding the first phase. But I won't be doing it alone." He turned to his team of corporate partners and business moguls who had come to observe his efforts. "You all came here out of curiosity. Now I'm asking you to do more than watch. I need your companies to step up." A few of them exchanged hesitant glances. "Why should we get involved?" one executive asked. "This isn't exactly our market." Jonathan smiled, a sharp, knowing smile. "Because it's not just about charity," he replied. "It's about rebuilding our society in a way that benefits everyone, including you." He tapped on the map. "A healthier, safer, and more stable community means lower crime, a stronger workforce, and a better economy. If we invest in these areas now, we don't just change lives, we change the future." The room fell silent. Then, one by one, hands started to raise. A tech company CEO leaned forward. "We'll sponsor job training programs." A construction mogul nodded. "We'll donate materials and manpower for new housing." A healthcare executive added, "We'll fund mobile clinics for long-term medical care." Jonathan nodded in satisfaction. "Good. Now, let's get to work." Meanwhile, Margaret and Emily watched everything unfold from the sidelines. Emily clutched her doll as she stared in awe at the volunteers setting up new tents and distributing supplies. "Grandma," she whispered, "people are really helping." Margaret wiped at her eyes. "I never thought I'd see the day." Just then, a young volunteer approached them, kneeling to Emily's level. "Hi there, sweetheart," she said kindly. "Would you like a new pair of shoes?" Emily blinked. I get to have shoes?" The volunteer smiled and opened a box, revealing a brand new pair of sneakers. Emily hesitated, glancing at her grandmother, who nodded encouragingly. Slowly, Emily reached out, touching the soft fabric as if making sure it was real. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. The volunteer beamed. "No, thank you, Emily. You remind us why we're doing this." Margaret pulled her granddaughter close, feeling a warmth in her chest she hadn't felt in years. For once they weren't alone. But not everyone welcomed Jonathan's movement with open arms. That afternoon, a group of city officials arrived, their faces tight with disapproval. At the front of the group was Richard Calloway, the same government representative who had confronted Jonathan earlier. "Mr. Hale, this has gone far enough," Calloway said sharply. "You can't just overhaul an entire city's infrastructure without working through the proper channels." Jonathan met his gaze, unflinching. "Then work with me," Calloway scoffed. "This isn't how the system works." Jonathan folded his arms. "That's exactly the problem." Tension crackled in the air. Around them, volunteers continued distributing food, medical teams treated patients, and construction crews assessed the area for long-term development. Jonathan motioned toward the scene. "Look at them, Calloway. Look at the people you've ignored for years. You've had your chance to fix this. Now it's my turn." Calloway's jaw clenched. "If you keep interfering with government processes, there will be legal consequences." Jonathan smirked. "Go ahead, sue me for feeding the hungry." A murmur spread through the crowd. Even Calloway's own team shifted uncomfortably at the idea of shutting down an effort that was clearly working. For the first time, Calloway looked unsure. Jonathan leaned in slightly. "Or, you can do your job and help me fix this city. It's your call." After a long silence, Calloway let out a slow breath. "I'll be in touch." And with that, He turned and left. Jonathan exhaled. He knew this was just the first battle in a much bigger war, but he wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. As night fell, Jonathan stood at the heart of the transformed alley, watching as the first stage of his plan unfolded. A makeshift medical station had been established. A temporary school was being planned. A community kitchen was being organized. And at the center of it all was Emily, laughing as she ran in her new shoes, her small hands gripping her grandmother's as if afraid this happiness might disappear. Jonathan turned to Daniel. "This isn't just a relief effort anymore." Daniel nodded. "It's a movement." Jonathan's expression hardened. "Then let's make sure it never stops." What had started as one man stopping to help an elderly woman and her granddaughter had turned into a movement. Within days, Jonathan Hale's initiative spread beyond the alleyway where it began. News outlets broadcasted live updates, social media flooded with support, and volunteers from across the city came forward to help. But Jonathan wasn't stopping at just one community. Sitting in his office overlooking the skyline, he reviewed reports from his team. More and more people were reaching out for help, entire neighborhoods, not just individuals. Daniel Carter, his senior advisor, flipped through a folder. "Sir, the impact is undeniable. Donations are pouring in, corporations are stepping up, and people want to be involved. But expanding this effort citywide, that's going to take a level of coordination we've never handled before." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Then we build the infrastructure to support it." He turned to Ethan Cross, his head of security. "I need a team in place, not just for logistics, but to ensure resources are reaching the right people. We can't let bureaucracy slow us down." Ethan gave a firm nod. "I'll make it happen." Jonathan exhaled, looking out at the city. "We're not just helping people, we're changing how things are done." And the world was watching. Back in the community where it all started, Margaret and Emily watched as their world changed before their eyes. The narrow alley where they had once lived in fear and hunger had been transformed. A temporary housing center had been set up. A mobile medical unit now provided health care to those who had gone without. A makeshift school was in place, ensuring children like Emily could learn. Emily sat at a small desk, clutching a real notebook for the first time in her life. Her teacher, a young woman named Sarah Monroe, smiled at the small group of children. "Today, we're going to start with reading. Who wants to go first?" Emily hesitated, then slowly raised her hand. Margaret watched from the doorway, her heart swelling with pride. Just a few weeks ago, she had feared Emily had no future. Now, she was watching her granddaughter's life change before her eyes. It wasn't long before Jonathan's work caught the attention of national leaders. A formal invitation arrived from the president, requesting Jonathan's presence at a White House summit on poverty and homelessness. Daniel handed him the letter. "Are you going to accept?" Jonathan smirked. "If they think I'm coming just to listen to them talk, they're mistaken. I'm going to tell them how we fix this, permanently." A week later, Jonathan stepped onto a stage in Washington, D.C., before a room filled with politicians, business leaders, and social activists. Cameras flashed. The world was watching. He adjusted the microphone and began his speech. "We live in a country that prides itself on being the land of opportunity. But opportunity doesn't exist when entire communities are invisible." The room fell silent. "We have the resources. We have the money. We have the power to change this. The only thing stopping us is the willingness to act." Some politicians shifted in their seats. Others nodded. "I'm not here to talk about what should be done. I'm here to show what's already being done, and what happens when people stop waiting for permission to fix what's broken." Applause rippled through the audience. "The way we care for our most vulnerable is the measure of who we are as a nation. And right now, we're failing." A hush fell over the crowd. That changes today. The applause was deafening. A nation inspired. Following Jonathan's speech, momentum exploded. Major corporations pledged funding for long-term housing projects. Nonprofits and charities partnered with his initiative, expanding its reach nationwide. City governments across the country sought to replicate his model. The movement was no longer just Jonathan Hale's. It belonged to everyone. Back at their new home, a modest but safe apartment in a rebuilt complex, Margaret held Emily close as they watched Jonathan's speech on television. "He kept his promise, Grandma," Emily whispered. "He really did it." Margaret wiped away a tear. Yes, baby, he did. For the first time in a long time, she didn't fear the future, because someone had finally listened. Jonathan stood on the balcony of his office, looking out at the city. Daniel joined him. You've done something incredible, sir. Jonathan shook his head. We're not done. Daniel raised an eyebrow. What's next? Jonathan's expression hardened. We take this nationwide. The movement had begun, and it wasn't stopping. Jonathan Hale had never been a man of small ambitions. What had begun as a single act of kindness, stopping for a homeless grandmother and her granddaughter, had evolved into a nationwide movement. The United States had seen sweeping changes, cities implementing housing reforms, corporations funding long-term programs, and communities rebuilding from the ground up. But Jonathan wasn't finished. As he stood in his office one evening, watching the city lights flicker beneath him, he felt a familiar pull. This wasn't just an American issue. Across the globe, millions of people faced the same struggles: poverty, homelessness, hunger, and hopelessness. And now that the world had witnessed the impact of his work, they were reaching out. The calls had already started coming in. Leaders from developing nations wanted guidance on rebuilding their own struggling communities. Charitable organizations sought partnerships to expand efforts worldwide. Activists in impoverished countries begged for solutions that had worked in the U.S. to be applied in their homelands. Jonathan didn't hesitate. We're going global. At a high-level board meeting, Jonathan laid out his next plan. Standing before a room full of business leaders, philanthropists, and world policymakers, he spoke with the same conviction that had started it all. We've proven that change is possible. We've rebuilt communities, lifted families out of poverty, and given people a future. But this isn't just America's story. It's a human story. He clicked a remote, and a world map appeared on the large screen behind him. Countries with severe poverty, Haiti, Kenya, India, Venezuela, the Philippines, and dozens more, were highlighted. This is where we go next, Jonathan said. We're launching the Global Hope Initiative, an expansion of our work to the places that need it most. The room erupted in conversation. Some nodded in agreement, others looked uncertain. Daniel Carter, his trusted advisor, leaned forward. Sir, taking this international is a whole different challenge. We're talking political barriers, logistical nightmares, and... Jonathan cut him off. I know, and I don't care. We do it anyway. He turned to the room. If anyone here doesn't have the guts for it, leave now. But if you want to be part of something that changes the world, stay, because we're about to make history. Not a single person left. The first international project was launched in Kenya, where entire villages lacked access to clean water, education, and stable housing. Jonathan flew there personally, stepping onto the dusty roads of a rural community where children walked miles just to collect water from contaminated sources. A young girl, Amara, no older than 10, approached him hesitantly. Mister, is it true? She asked. Is it true you can make the water clean? Jonathan knelt to her level. Yes, Amara, it's true. Tears filled her eyes. Then my little brother won't be sick anymore? Jonathan felt his chest tighten. No, sweetheart, he won't be sick anymore. And with that, the construction of the first water filtration system began. Within weeks, the village had something they had never dared to dream of: fresh, safe drinking water. And for the first time, Amara smiled without fear. Expanding the movement internationally was not without resistance. Some governments feared foreign intervention. Corrupt officials sought to block efforts unless they profited. Critics labeled it Western interference. Jonathan didn't let any of it stop him. At a heated United Nations summit, he stood before world leaders and called them out directly. People are dying while you argue over politics. This isn't about power. It's about humanity. Either you step up or you step aside. But I will not stand by while millions suffer. His words shook the room. One by one, governments began pledging support. Some out of genuine belief in his mission, others because they knew they would look like villains if they didn't. Either way, Jonathan didn't care. The work was getting done. One of the hardest hit areas was Venezuela, where economic collapse had left thousands of children malnourished and families in extreme poverty. Jonathan arrived in a small community where parents struggled to feed their children. A woman named Maria clutched her frail son, Luis, tears streaming down her face. I just want him to eat, she whispered. Jonathan turned to his team. Get them food, today, no delays. Within hours, emergency food shipments arrived, and community kitchens were set up. Luis took his first full meal in days, his little hands gripping the spoon as if afraid it would disappear. Maria sobbed with relief. You saved my boy. Jonathan shook his head. No, Maria, we saved each other. Months later, Jonathan stood before a massive crowd at a new housing development in India, where thousands of formerly homeless families now had roofs over their heads. Behind him, a monument was unveiled, a simple but powerful sculpture of a child holding an elderly woman's hand. The inscription read, Hope begins in the smallest places. Margaret and Emily, now living in a stable home in America, watched the broadcast from their living room. Margaret wiped a tear away. He did it, Emily. He took our story and changed the world. Emily, now a little older, smiled. One person can make a difference, Grandma. You taught me that. Back in his office, Jonathan received an urgent call from his team. Sir, a typhoon just hit the Philippines. Thousands are homeless. What do we do? Jonathan didn't even hesitate. We go. We help. We rebuild. As he hung up, Daniel Carter shook his head with a smirk. You're never going to stop, are you? Jonathan smiled. Not until the world stops needing us. And with that, the movement continued, unstoppable, unwavering, and filled with hope. Because as long as there were people suffering, there was work to be done. It had been 5 years since Jonathan Hale first stopped his car for Margaret Whitmore and her granddaughter, Emily. What had begun as a single act of kindness had grown into one of the largest humanitarian movements in history. Millions of people had been lifted out of poverty. Entire communities had been rebuilt from the ground up. Children who had once begged for food were now sitting in classrooms, dreaming of bright futures. The Global Hope Initiative was no longer just a project. It was a force of nature, spanning across dozens of countries, bringing real, tangible change to the people who had once been invisible. And yet, Jonathan knew the work was far from over. Back in the United States, Margaret and Emily now lived in a modest but beautiful 2-bedroom home, gifted to them as part of the first housing project. Emily, now a teenager, sat at the wooden dining table, flipping through the pages of a book. Margaret, older now, moved slowly but happily as she prepared tea. On the news, a reporter covered the latest expansion of the movement, showing clips of new schools being built in Southeast Asia, a clean water system installed in South America, and medical teams saving lives in war-torn regions. Margaret placed a hand over her heart. He did it, she whispered. He really did it. Emily smiled. And it all started with you, Grandma. If you hadn't held up that sign that day, none of this would have happened. Margaret chuckled softly. Oh, sweetheart, I was just a desperate old woman trying to save her granddaughter. It was Jonathan who saw something more. Emily shook her head. Number. He saw you. He saw us. And he decided we mattered. Margaret reached for Emily's hand, squeezing it gently. And now, because of him, we have a future. A future neither of them had dared to dream of before. To mark the 5th anniversary of the movement, a massive global summit was organized in Washington, D.C. World leaders, business moguls, activists, and everyday people who had been touched by the initiative gathered to celebrate what had been achieved and what was still to come. The highlight of the evening was a special address by Jonathan Hale. As he stepped onto the grand stage, the audience fell silent. Cameras flashed, broadcasting his speech to millions across the globe. Jonathan took a deep breath. 5 years ago, I stopped my car because I saw an old woman standing on a street corner, holding a sign. A murmur of recognition spread through the crowd. Everyone knew the story. She didn't ask for herself. She was asking for her granddaughter. And in that moment, I realized that we, as a society, had failed them. Not because we lacked resources, not because we lacked solutions, but because we lacked the willingness to act. The room hung onto every word. But I also realized something else. We could do better. And so we did. He gestured to a large screen behind him, where images of transformation flashed. Families moving into new homes, children drinking clean water, doctors treating patients in once neglected villages. This movement isn't just about charity, Jonathan continued. It's about restoring dignity. It's about showing people that they are seen, They are heard, and they matter. He paused, letting the words sink in. But our work isn't done. Not yet. Because as long as there's a child who goes to bed hungry, a mother who has no safe home for her family, or a community that has been forgotten by the world, we will keep going. Thunderous applause erupted, many in the audience wiping away tears. This is not the end of the journey, Jonathan finished. This is only the beginning. As part of the celebration, a monument was unveiled in the heart of Washington, D.C. Standing tall in the National Mall was a bronze statue of an elderly woman holding a young girl's hand, looking up toward the future. The inscription read, "Hope begins in the smallest places." Margaret and Emily stood at the foot of the monument, staring up at their own story, immortalized in history. Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. "We're part of something bigger than ourselves now." Emily squeezed her hand. "We always were, Grandma." The world just finally noticed. After the summit, Jonathan stood in his office, watching the skyline, deep in thought. Daniel Carter walked in, holding a tablet filled with new reports. "Sir, the movement has hit every continent, but there are still regions in need, places suffering from war, famine, and economic collapse. Where do we go next?" Jonathan didn't hesitate. "Everywhere." Daniel chuckled. "You're really never going to stop, are you?" Jonathan smirked. "Not until the world doesn't need us anymore." He turned back to the window, his gaze focused on the horizon. Because as long as there was someone suffering, his journey wasn't over. Not yet. Not ever. If this story touched your heart, hit the subscribe button and join us in spreading more stories of hope, courage, and transformation. Together, we can inspire the world, one story at a time.